In the dark hours before dawn on the 23rd day of September in 1943, somewhere in the vast expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean, the water lay still and undisturbed beneath a sky choked with clouds. No moonlight penetrated the thick overcast that blanketed the sea, and the absence of celestial illumination created precisely the kind of conditions that German submarine commanders had learned to treasure. The darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything, transforming the ocean into an impenetrable void where shapes dissolved and distances became impossible to judge. For the men who commanded the underwater vessels of the Kriegsmarine, such nights represented opportunity, the chance to operate with the confidence that came from knowing the enemy could not possibly detect their presence. Standing at his periscope in the cramped confines of his submarine's control room, a German officer named Heinz Fischer occupied the position of captain lieutenant, a rank that carried with it the terrible burden of responsibility for every soul aboard his vessel. Through the optical lenses of his periscope, he observed the silhouettes of merchant ships arranged in their protective formation, a convoy that stretched across several miles of ocean, moving steadily through waters that Fischer considered his hunting grounds. The confidence that filled him in those moments came from years of accumulated experience, from countless successful attacks executed under similar conditions of darkness and invisibility. The German submarine fleet had spent the better part of 4 years prowling these waters with a sense of near-total impunity, surfacing under the protective blanket of night to unleash their torpedoes against unsuspecting targets before slipping away into the depths, vanishing like phantoms before any retribution could find them. This particular evening, Fischer harboured every expectation of adding another victory to his personal tally, another merchant vessel sent to the bottom, another contribution to the campaign of economic strangulation that Germany hoped would force Britain to its knees. The strategic calculus was straightforward in the minds of German naval planners: sink enough ships, destroy enough cargo, and eventually the island nation would be unable to sustain itself. The mathematics of tonnage warfare dominated their thinking, a cold calculation of how many thousands of tons of shipping needed to be destroyed each month to achieve the desired effect. Fischer and his fellow submarine commanders were the instruments of this strategy, the human agents tasked with executing what amounted to an industrial-scale campaign of destruction. But then, in an instant that would forever divide his life into before and after, everything changed. Without any warning whatsoever, without any sound or indication that might have given him even a moment's preparation, brilliant beams of light suddenly tore through the darkness, searchlights from what he instantly recognized as Allied destroyers, and these enemy warships were turning directly toward his position with a precision that seemed impossible. Their guns were already firing, the muzzle flashes visible even before the sound of the explosions could reach his ears across the water. The scene unfolded with a nightmarish quality, as though someone had suddenly illuminated a stage where Fischer had believed himself to be performing in complete privacy. Within seconds, the first depth charges began to detonate around his submarine, massive underwater explosions that sent shockwaves rippling through the hull, causing the entire vessel to shudder and groan under the punishment. Fischer's scream cut through the confined space of the control room, his voice carrying a mixture of terror and complete incomprehension as he shouted that the enemy could see them, a statement that seemed to violate everything he understood about naval warfare at night. He gave immediate orders to dive, to take the submarine down into the protective depths where darkness still reigned supreme, but even as his crew scrambled to execute his commands, even as the vessel angled downward into the black water, the terrible truth had already begun to crystallize in his mind. The Allied forces possessed some kind of weapon, something invisible to human eyes, but absolutely lethal to submarines, something that rendered all his experience and all his tactical knowledge suddenly obsolete. The word that would eventually explain his predicament was one he had heard before but never fully appreciated: radar. For submarine captains throughout the German fleet, radar represented a nightmare beyond their capacity to fully comprehend or counter. Their entire operational doctrine, the fundamental strategic approach that governed every aspect of submarine warfare, rested upon a foundation of stealth and invisibility. The standard pattern called for surfacing during the hours of darkness, launching attacks against enemy convoys while protected by the night, and then disappearing back into the depths before dawn could reveal their presence. This approach had worked with devastating effectiveness for years, allowing German submarines to inflict catastrophic losses on Allied shipping. But somewhere during the years 1942 and 1943, something fundamental had shifted in the balance of the undersea war. Allied escort vessels had begun finding German submarines in total darkness, locating them with uncanny accuracy, even when heavy fog reduced visibility to mere yards, detecting them at distances that extended far beyond the range of any human lookout's vision. To the German submariners struggling to understand what was happening to them, the situation seemed to border on the supernatural. Reports filtered back from patrol after patrol, accounts that strained credibility, stories of submarines being attacked in conditions where visual detection should have been absolutely impossible. Some captains speculated about new acoustic technologies. Others wondered if the Allies had developed some enhanced form of human perception, and a few even entertained theories that verged on the occult. What they did not fully grasp, what German intelligence had failed to adequately assess, was that they were facing a technological revolution that had fundamentally transformed the nature of naval warfare. The reality behind these mysterious detections was rooted in the development work being conducted in Britain, where scientists and engineers had achieved a breakthrough that would prove decisive in the Battle of the Atlantic. British researchers working in the field of radio detection and ranging had succeeded in developing what came to be known as centimetric radar, a new generation of detection equipment that operated at wavelengths far shorter than the metric radar systems that had preceded it. This shift to shorter wavelengths, measured in centimeters rather than meters, brought with it a constellation of advantages that made the technology exponentially more effective for the specific purpose of detecting submarines. The key distinction between the older metric radar and the new centimetric systems lay not just in their wavelength, but in their practical implications for submarine warfare. The metric radar that German intelligence was familiar with, the type that had been deployed earlier in the war, operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had been deployed earlier in the war operated on wavelengths that German intelligence was familiar with. The type that had submarines could detect with their onboard warning receivers. When a submarine's detection equipment picked up the characteristic emissions of metric radar, it gave the crew warning that they were being illuminated, that someone was attempting to locate them electronically. This warning provided time to dive, time to escape detection before an attack could be pressed home. But centimetric radar operated on wavelengths that were completely invisible to the German detection equipment that submarines carried. A submarine could be bathed in the emissions of centimetric radar without having any indication whatsoever that it was being tracked, located, targeted. By the time the submarine crew realized they had been detected, it was typically far too late to take any effective evasive action. The platforms carrying this revolutionary technology included both aircraft and surface vessels. Long-range patrol planes like the Consolidated Liberator and the short Sunderland flying boat could be equipped with centimetric radar sets that allowed them to detect a submarine's periscope or the upper portion of its conning tower breaking the surface of the ocean, even at night, even from distances measured in miles. On the surface, destroyers and corvettes mounting these same radar systems gained the ability to spot surfaced submarines under conditions where human lookouts would be completely blind. The tactical implications were staggering. What had once been a submarine's safest time, the dark hours when they could operate with confidence on the surface, had suddenly become a period of maximum vulnerability. Behind this technological transformation lay an industrial and scientific effort of extraordinary scale, a mobilization of resources and expertise that the German leadership had fundamentally underestimated. By the middle months of 1943, Allied factories had ramped up production to the point where they were manufacturing radar sets not by the hundreds or even by the thousands, but by the tens of thousands. The production lines ran continuously, churning out unit after unit of equipment that would be distributed across the Allied anti-submarine forces. British scientists working at an establishment known as the Telecommunications Research Establishment had developed the critical component that made compact, powerful radar systems possible, the cavity magnetron. This device, the cavity magnetron, represented a genuine breakthrough in the field of microwave generation. It was a vacuum tube that could produce high-powered microwave radiation at the centimetric wavelengths needed for effective radar, and it could do so in a package small enough to be mounted in an aircraft or aboard a relatively small naval vessel. The strategic importance of this invention can hardly be overstated. When British representatives travelled to the United States in 1940 and shared this technology with their American counterparts, they effectively handed over one of their most valuable military secrets, recognizing that American industrial capacity would be necessary to produce these devices in the quantities that would be required to equip the entire Allied anti-submarine effort. The American response to receiving this technology demonstrated the industrial might that would ultimately prove decisive in so many aspects of the Second World War. In Massachusetts, at an institution known as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a special laboratory was established specifically to work on radar development and production. This facility, called the Radiation Laboratory, became a center of intense scientific and engineering activity. The researchers and engineers working there ultimately produced more than 150 different radar designs, each tailored to specific operational requirements, each representing an iteration and refinement of the basic technology. Meanwhile, in factories across the United States, production lines were established to manufacture the cavity magnetrons that these radar sets required. By the time the war ended, American factories had produced more than 100,000 magnetrons, a quantity sufficient to equip not just every major warship and patrol aircraft, but to ensure that radar sets could be distributed far down the chain to even relatively minor vessels and platforms. German intelligence services were aware that the Allied powers possessed radar technology. This was not a complete secret, and indeed Germany had its own radar development programs. But what German analysts fundamentally failed to grasp was the sheer scale of Allied radar deployment. The assessments produced by Admiral Karl Dönitz's staff, the headquarters personnel responsible for directing U-boat operations, operated under the assumption that radar was a relatively rare and precious piece of equipment, likely to be deployed only aboard capital ships like battleships and aircraft carriers. This assumption made a certain logical sense from the German perspective. Radar sets were complex, expensive pieces of equipment, and it seemed reasonable to assume that they would be reserved for the most valuable vessels. The reality, however, was that Allied production had reached such heights that even small corvettes, the relatively inexpensive escort vessels that formed the backbone of convoy protection, were being fitted with radar sets as a matter of routine. More remarkably still, even merchant vessels, the civilian ships that made up the convoys themselves, were increasingly carrying their own radar equipment. This massive discrepancy between German assumptions and Allied capabilities was further obscured by a deliberate campaign of deception that the Allied command pursued with considerable sophistication. Whenever a German submarine was destroyed or forced to surrender, the official reports and announcements regarding how the submarine had been located and attacked would typically attribute the success to conventional methods. The reports might credit improved training of lookouts, describe how alert observers had managed to spot the submarine visually, or suggest that the encounter had been a matter of fortunate chance, a lucky sighting in the right place at the right time. This consistent pattern of misattribution served a deliberate strategic purpose. It kept the German command guessing about the true effectiveness of Allied radar, preventing them from fully understanding the nature of the threat their submarines faced. The diaries and journals kept by U-boat commanders, some of which were later captured and examined by Allied intelligence, reveal the state of confusion and speculation that prevailed among the German submarine force. Without accurate information about what was actually detecting them, these experienced naval officers found themselves grasping at theories that ranged from the plausible to the bizarre. Some submarine commanders developed elaborate theories about improvements in Allied lookout procedures, convincing themselves that the enemy had somehow developed superior training methods that enhanced human visual capabilities. Others speculated about acoustic detection methods, wondering if some new form of underwater listening device was being employed. A few entries in these captured diaries reveal theories that seem almost comical in retrospect. There were submarine commanders who seriously entertained the notion that Allied vessels had trained cats aboard, somehow using the animal's superior night vision or other enhanced senses to detect submarines. Other theories attributed the mysterious detections to flocks of trained birds that could somehow communicate the presence of submarines to Allied vessels. The sheer variety of these speculations reveals just how effectively the Allied deception campaign had worked, keeping the German submarine force in the dark about the true nature of the threat. The statistical evidence of radar's impact on submarine warfare became impossible to ignore by the middle of 1943. During that year alone, the Kriegsmarine lost 237 submarines, a devastating toll that represented roughly 1/4 of the operational submarine fleet. To put this in perspective, 237 submarines meant thousands of trained crew members lost, representing not just the immediate tactical defeat of those particular vessels, but the long-term strategic depletion of experienced personnel who could not be easily replaced. Many of these submarines never managed to fire a single torpedo during their final patrol. They were spotted on the surface during the hours of darkness by radar-equipped patrol aircraft, attacked before their crews even had any indication that they had been detected. The sudden, shocking violence of these attacks left little room for survival. Among German submariners, the month of May in 1943 acquired a particularly ominous reputation, becoming known as Black May in the informal parlance of the U-boat force. During this single month, 41 German submarines were lost, a catastrophic rate of attrition that made clear the ocean had fundamentally turned against them. The psychological impact of these losses rippled through the entire submarine service, undermining the confidence and morale that had once characterized these elite forces. Fischer and his fellow submarine commanders found themselves trapped in a new and merciless pattern of warfare that inverted everything they had been trained to expect. The sequence typically unfolded like this. A submarine would surface during the night hours to recharge its batteries, a routine and necessary operation that every submarine had to perform regularly. The crew would be absolutely certain that they were hidden by darkness, protected by the night from any observation. Then, with shocking suddenness, an aircraft would materialize seemingly out of nowhere, appearing as if by magic directly above the submarine's position. These patrol bombers, liberators flying extended missions over the Atlantic, carried not just radar, but also a piece of equipment that became known as the Lee light, a powerful searchlight whose operation was slaved to the radar system. The tactical sequence was brutally effective. The aircraft would approach guided by radar, closing the distance to the surfaced submarine while remaining completely undetected. Then, at the critical moment when the aircraft was positioned for attack, the Lee light would suddenly activate, a brilliant beam of illumination that would snap on with blinding intensity, catching the submarine crew completely by surprise while simultaneously illuminating the target for the aircraft's weapons. In the seconds that followed, bombs and depth charges would fall, often before the submarine crew could even begin to react, before the order to dive could be given, before hatches could be sealed, and the vessel could begin to submerge. One German submariner who survived such an attack attempted to describe the experience, and his words convey something of the psychological shock involved. He said it was as if the sun itself had risen for his submarine alone, as though some cosmic spotlight had singled them out specifically, and then in the next instant the sea around them had exploded into chaos. This combination of the sudden blinding light followed immediately by the violence of the attack created a traumatic experience that left deep psychological scars on those who lived through it. The sense of vulnerability it engendered was profound and deeply unsettling to men who had been trained to think of themselves as predators, as hunters prowling the ocean in search of prey. The transformation in the psychological state of the U-boat force was dramatic and comprehensive. Submariners who had once considered themselves the wolves of the sea, feared apex predators who struck terror into merchant convoys, now found themselves reduced to the status of hunted animals, prey being stalked relentlessly by enemies equipped with senses that seemed almost preternatural. The statistical data from the period confirms this shift in the most brutal terms possible. By the time the calendar turned to 1944, Allied patrol aircraft and surface vessels equipped with centimetric radar were accounting for the majority of successful attacks on German submarines. The once proud U-boat arm, which in the earlier years of the war had nearly succeeded in severing Britain's maritime lifelines and starving the island nation into submission, had been reduced to what amounted to a slaughter. Survival rates plummeted, and among the crews still being sent out on patrol, a sense of fatalism began to take hold. Sailors whispered among themselves about death beams, convincing themselves that the Allied forces must have invented some kind of directed energy weapon that existed beyond the boundaries of known science. This belief in a death beam reflected not just ignorance about radar technology, but also a kind of psychological defense mechanism, a way of explaining the inexplicable and maintaining some shred of dignity in the face of complete technological inferiority. If the enemy possessed weapons beyond science, weapons that partook of something almost magical, then there was no shame in being defeated by such means. The alternative, accepting that they were simply being outmatched by superior technology and industrial production, was perhaps even more demoralizing. What remains less widely known, even in detailed historical accounts of the Battle of the Atlantic, is the full extent of how far the reach of Allied detection technology eventually extended. By 1944, Allied scientists and engineers had perfected yet another innovation in anti-submarine warfare, the sonobuoy. These were small floating sensors, relatively simple devices that could be dropped from aircraft into the ocean. Once in the water, these sensors would float on the surface, suspended by a small buoy, while beneath the waterline hydrophones listened for underwater sounds. The acoustic data picked up by these hydrophones would then be transmitted via radio back to the aircraft that had deployed them, giving patrol planes the ability to detect submerged submarines through their propeller noise and other acoustic signatures. When this technology was combined with radar coverage of the surface, it created what amounted to a comprehensive detection network from which submarines had virtually no escape. A U-boat could no longer hide beneath the waves in the hope that its submerged position would protect it from detection because its presence could be betrayed by the sounds it generated underwater. And when that submarine eventually had to surface to recharge batteries or simply to transit at higher speeds, radar would immediately mark its position, bringing down swift retribution. Admiral Dönitz, the commander of the German submarine fleet and one of the most experienced submarine warfare practitioners in the world, eventually came to a stark realization about what his forces were facing. In communications with his superiors and in his own strategic assessments, he described the situation as a technological war that Germany could not win. This was an extraordinary admission from a man who had devoted his career to submarine warfare, who had helped develop the tactics and strategies that had made the U-boat such an effective weapon in the first place. But the evidence had become overwhelming. Germany simply could not match the technological sophistication or the industrial output that the Allied powers were bringing to bear in the anti-submarine campaign. However, the impact of radar technology extended far beyond simple detection of submarines. It fundamentally transformed the entire nature of convoy battles, reshaping the tactical and operational environment in ways that gave Allied forces decisive advantages. Before the widespread deployment of radar, escort commanders had been forced to rely on human lookouts stationed on deck, sailors who would strain their eyes attempting to peer through darkness, fog, rain, and spray in the desperate hope of spotting a submarine before it could launch an attack. This was an inherently unreliable method of defense, particularly at night or in poor weather conditions when visibility might be reduced to virtually nothing. But with radar, everything changed. A single corvette equipped with even a modest radar set could suddenly track dozens of surface contacts simultaneously, maintaining continuous awareness of the tactical situation even in total darkness or the densest fog. Convoy commanders found themselves in possession of what one British officer described as the ability to lift the fog of war literally. Where previously they had been operating in conditions of profound uncertainty, never quite sure where the threats might be lurking, now they could perceive the tactical environment with a clarity that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. This situational awareness allowed for much more effective coordination of escort forces, enabling commanders to position their vessels optimally to protect the vulnerable merchant ships under their care. A merchant sailor who served aboard one of these protected convoys later recalled an incident that perfectly illustrated the new reality of naval warfare. During the night, while travelling in complete darkness, he watched as the escort vessel assigned to his sector suddenly veered sharply, changing course with obvious purpose, despite the fact that nothing was visible to the naked eye. Seconds later, the escort opened fire with its deck guns, engaging a surfaced submarine that none of the merchant crew had seen or could see, even as the engagement unfolded. The submarine had been detected purely by radar, targeted and attacked without any need for visual confirmation. The precision and confidence of the attack left a deep impression on the merchant sailor, who suddenly understood that he was protected by capabilities that transformed the nature of the threat environment. The industrial dimension of this technological revolution cannot be overstated, because it was ultimately industrial capacity that determined how comprehensively these new technologies could be deployed. American factory production reached levels that would have seemed fantastical in the pre-war period. By 1944, American shipyards and aircraft factories were producing new vessels and planes at a rate that allowed radar equipment to be installed as standard fit-out on virtually every platform. The famous Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that became the workhorses of the Allied merchant fleet, were equipped with radar sets that transformed these simple freighters into valuable intelligence-gathering platforms. Even tankers operating independently, sailing alone rather than in convoy, carried radar equipment that outperformed the best detection gear available to German submarines. U-boat captains filed increasingly bitter complaints about the inadequacy of their own detection equipment, particularly the METOX radar warning receiver that had been issued to submarines as a defensive measure. The METOX had been designed to detect the emissions from Allied metric radar, giving submarines warning that they were being illuminated and allowing them time to dive to safety. But against the new centimetric radar that was being deployed throughout the Allied anti-submarine forces, the METOX was completely useless. It provided no warning whatsoever, giving no alarm even as centimetric radar waves painted the submarine from multiple directions. Many U-boats sailed into their final patrols essentially blind to the electronic surveillance being conducted against them, their crews not even realizing that they were already being tracked and targeted until the moment of attack arrived. There exists another detail from this period, one that has received less attention in popular histories, but which reveals just how thoroughly the Germans were outmatched in the electronic warfare dimension of the submarine campaign. In late 1942, German submarine crews received orders to keep their METOX radar warning receivers running continuously throughout their patrols. The logic behind this order seemed sound. By maintaining constant watch on the electromagnetic spectrum, submarines would maximize their chances of detecting Allied radar emissions and thus receiving warning of impending danger. However, British scientists, who were well aware of how German submarines were using the METOX system, developed a clever countermeasure. They modified their radar sets to emit faint signals that would blend into the background electromagnetic noise of the ocean environment. These signals were designed to mimic the normal static and interference that the METOX receivers would pick up from natural sources and from the submarine's own electrical systems. The result was that German submariners, monitoring their METOX receivers and hearing only normal background noise, would be lulled into a false sense of security. They would interpret the absence of strong radar signals as confirmation that they were not being observed, that no Allied aircraft or surface vessel was actively searching for them. Based on this faulty assessment, they would feel safe surfacing more frequently, spending more time on the surface to charge batteries or simply to make better speed on their transit routes. And of course, the entire time they were actually being tracked by centimetric radar against which their METOX provided no protection whatsoever. The submarines that fell victim to this deception were promptly destroyed, often with their crews never understanding how they had been found. It was only considerably later that German engineers and intelligence analysts began to piece together what had happened, recognizing the sophisticated deception that had been practiced against them. The mathematics of industrial production doomed German submarines to defeat through sheer weight of numbers, even beyond the technological advantages that Allied forces enjoyed. Consider the aircraft production figures alone. The United States manufactured 96,000 aircraft during the year 1944. This is a number so large as to be difficult to truly comprehend, 96,000 aircraft in a single year from a single nation's industrial base. Thousands upon thousands of these aircraft were fitted with radar equipment and assigned to anti-submarine patrol duties. The British Coastal Command, which bore primary responsibility for providing air cover over the Atlantic convoy routes, had struggled in the early years of the war with severe shortages of long-range patrol aircraft. But by the middle years of the war, this situation had been completely reversed. Coastal Command now operated large numbers of radar-equipped Liberator bombers, aircraft with the range to patrol far out into the Atlantic, covering areas that had previously represented gaps in aerial coverage where submarines could operate with relative impunity. These gaps in coverage, particularly the mid-Atlantic air gap that had existed beyond the range of land-based aircraft operating from either North America or Britain, had once served as sanctuaries where German submarines could operate on the surface with reasonable confidence that they would not encounter aerial attack. But as new aircraft with extended range became available, fitted with radar that could detect submarines from miles away, these sanctuaries ceased to exist. German submarine captains, who had grown accustomed to treating certain areas of the Atlantic as relatively safe zones, suddenly found themselves under attack in waters where they had previously operated unmolested. The ocean that had once seemed vast enough to hide in had shrunk dramatically, compressed by the reach of technology until there was nowhere left to run. By the time the calendar turned to 1945 and the war entered its final phase, the German U-boat force was in a state of complete collapse. Out of approximately 40,000 men who served in the submarine branch of the Kriegsmarine over the course of the war, some 30,000 would die, never returning from patrol. This represents a casualty rate of 75%, making the U-boat service the deadliest branch of military service in the entire German armed forces, more dangerous even than the most exposed frontline infantry units or the strategic bomber crews that flew suicidal missions against heavily defended targets. Many of these submariners perished without ever catching sight of their attackers, killed by enemies they never saw, never had a chance to fight back against. The survivors who made it home carried with them descriptions of depth-charge attacks that seemed guided with eerie precision, patterns of attack that demonstrated the enemy somehow always knew exactly where the submarine was located even when submerged, even when running silent and deep. One survivor attempted to articulate this experience, saying that it felt as though the ocean itself had betrayed them, as though the very water they moved through was somehow reporting their position to the enemy above. In a sense, this perception was not far from the truth, though the mechanism was not some mystical betrayal by the ocean, but rather the cold reality of radar technology backed by overwhelming industrial production, sustained logistical networks, and systematic scientific development. The Allied anti-submarine campaign represented warfare prosecuted with mathematical precision, treating the destruction of submarines as an industrial process to be optimized through better technology, better training, better coordination, and better equipment deployed in overwhelming quantities. The historical record contains bitter ironies when we examine how Germany came to find itself so completely outmatched in the technological dimension of submarine warfare. German scientists had themselves conducted experiments with radar technology during the pre-war period, exploring the same basic principles that would later be developed into the Allied systems that proved so devastating. But the Nazi leadership, operating from a position of overconfidence bordering on hubris, had largely dismissed radar as an interesting scientific curiosity without serious military applications. Hermann Göring, who held the position of Reichsmarschall and exercised considerable influence over German military technology development, had reportedly mocked radar development as nothing more than a toy for scientists to play with, not deserving of serious investment or priority in resource allocation. When British radar played a crucial role in defeating the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, allowing RAF fighter controllers to direct their limited forces with devastating effectiveness against German bomber streams, the German military establishment began to realize what they had overlooked. But this realization came too late to prevent the consequences from unfolding in the Atlantic, where the price of that earlier dismissiveness would be paid in the form of steel coffins scattered across the ocean floor, submarines that became tombs for their crews. The German attempts to catch up in radar technology, to develop their own sophisticated systems that might counter what the Allies had deployed, consistently fell short, constrained by resource limitations, by the disruption caused by Allied bombing of German industrial facilities, and by the simple fact that they had started too late and fallen too far behind. There exists one more detail from the historical record of this period, a small fact that rarely finds its way into conventional histories, but which captures something significant about the state of the U-boat war by 1943. Near the Azores Islands, Allied forces captured a German submarine that had been damaged and forced to surface. When American intelligence officers examined the wreck of this submarine, exploring its interior compartments, they discovered in the galley crates filled with Portuguese oranges, fresh fruit that the crew had clearly been consuming as part of their rations. The officers who made this discovery noted the profound irony of the situation. Germany, a nation whose civilian population was increasingly suffering from severe food shortages and rationing as the war ground on, whose people often went hungry, was nevertheless managing to supply its submarine crews with imported luxury items like fresh citrus fruit. Meanwhile, directly overhead, Allied patrol aircraft equipped with radar flew their search patterns, hunting for submarines to destroy. The image created by this juxtaposition, luxury provisions inside a vessel that was effectively already doomed, with the instruments of that doom circling overhead, became for some observers a kind of symbol representing the decline and futility of the entire U-boat campaign. The submarines that had once been Germany's most feared and effective naval weapons, the tools with which they had hoped to strangle Allied commerce and win the war at sea, had been reduced to expensive, elaborate death traps that consumed resources and men without achieving any meaningful strategic effect. For submarine commanders like Heinz Fischer, the man whose experience opened this narrative, the dawning realization of what was happening must have been psychologically crushing in ways difficult to fully articulate. The U-boat had represented not just a weapon, but a symbol of German naval power, an embodiment of the idea that technological sophistication and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantages. The successes of the early war years, the period when U-boats had roamed almost at will through the Atlantic shipping lanes, had created a sense of confidence and even invincibility among many submariners. To watch that confidence crumble, to feel the balance of technological advantage shift decisively against them, to recognize that every patrol now carried with it an overwhelming likelihood of death. This represented a form of psychological defeat that preceded and accompanied the physical destruction of the submarine force. On that night in September of 1943, as depth charges hammered against the hull of Fisher's submarine, as water began to force its way through failing seals and the structure of the vessel started to give way under the punishment, Fisher had to confront the end of everything he had believed about submarine warfare. His vessel was crippled, unable to escape, unable to fight back effectively, unable to do anything except absorb damage until it either sank entirely or he made the decision to end the agony. He gave the order to surface, though surfacing meant surrender, meant the end of his service, meant capture and imprisonment. As his crew abandoned the sinking submarine and were pulled aboard a British corvette, Fisher found himself muttering words that attempted to make sense of what had happened to him. He said that what they had experienced was not war, not as he understood war, but rather science itself turned into a weapon against them. In one sense, Fisher's assessment was incomplete or even mistaken. What he had experienced was indeed war, warfare conducted with all the ruthlessness and violence that term implies. But he was correct in recognizing that science had become an integral and perhaps dominant component of that warfare. Radar represented the conversion of scientific understanding into operational military capability, the transformation of theoretical knowledge about electromagnetic radiation into practical tools for detecting and destroying enemy forces. The Battle of the Atlantic had indeed evolved beyond a simple contest of ships and sailors into something more complex and more deterministic, a struggle that would ultimately be decided by industrial capacity, by scientific sophistication, by the ability to deploy technology at scale across an entire theatre of operations. The mathematics of the situation, the cold calculations of production rates and deployment numbers and effectiveness percentages, had become just as important as the courage or skill of individual combatants. German submariners were brave, often extraordinarily so, and many possessed exceptional skill in their deadly profession. But bravery and skill could not overcome the fundamental imbalance in technological capability and industrial output. The radar that had made the invisible visible, that had robbed submarines of their greatest tactical advantage, the ability to hide in darkness and distance, had fundamentally broken the back of the U-boat campaign. By the latter half of the war, German submarines continued to go out on patrol, continued to attempt their missions, but they did so without any realistic hope of achieving the strategic objectives that had once seemed within reach. The campaign continued not because it could succeed, but because surrender was not yet an option, because the larger war still demanded that Germany employ every available weapon, even when those weapons had become ineffective. The transformation wrought by radar in the Atlantic theatre stands as one of the clearest examples from the Second World War of how technological innovation could decisively shift strategic balance, how a single category of equipment could render obsolete an entire approach to warfare, how science and industry could combine to determine outcomes in ways that pure military valor could not overcome. For the men who served in German submarines, who went out patrol after patrol into increasingly hopeless tactical situations, the war had become an experience of being hunted by enemies they could not see, detected by means they could not counter, attacked by forces they could not effectively fight back against. The psychological toll of this experience compounded the physical danger, creating conditions that made submarine service into a kind of slow-motion collective catastrophe, a branch of service where survival became increasingly unlikely and death increasingly certain with each passing month. The ocean that had once seemed to offer concealment and protection had been transformed into a transparent medium where every movement, every moment spent on the surface, carried with it the risk of detection and destruction. The darkness that had been the submariner's friend had been penetrated by electronic eyes that never slept, never blinked, never lost their vigilance. The vastness of the Atlantic, which had seemed large enough to hide entire fleets of submarines, had been compressed and made navigable through the application of radar technology to the anti-submarine mission. And through it all, the factories in Britain and America continued to produce more radar sets, more patrol aircraft, more escort vessels, more of everything needed to press the campaign forward with relentless momentum. The industrial and scientific mobilization that made this possible represented a form of warfare that transcended individual battles or engagements, operating at a level of systematic application that left little room for dramatic reversals or last-minute salvation. The outcome, once the technological and industrial trends became clear, was effectively determined. What remained was simply the playing out of those trends to their inevitable conclusion, measured in submarines lost, crews killed, and strategic objectives abandoned as unattainable.